Hello, welcome to this episode of The Cusp. I'm Doy Santos, your host. So this is the third in a series that we've called Can Duterte Avoid the Pitfalls of Marcos, in which we're asking the question whether or not President Duterte can avoid the biggest mistakes that President Marcos made when he was in office. In the first two installments of this series, we looked at the problems that Marcos encountered. The first pitfall that we encountered was his desire for absolute power, and in doing so, his lack of any form of accountability as a totalitarian. In the second in the second installment, we looked at two pitfalls, which were greed and hubris. And in both installments, we found that while there were many similarities between the experience of President Duterte and President Marcos, that President Duterte is still somewhat a more moderate version of President Marcos. And he hasn't necessarily, or it hasn't been proven yet, that he has fallen into the same pitfalls so far. In this third installment, I'm going to be discussing the misguided use of force for attaining his goals or his vision of a better society, also known as the might is right pitfall. And this is perhaps the most likely pitfall to ensnare President Duterte. President Marcos justified his use of force to save the nation from the stranglehold of the oligarchs and the threat of communist rebellion, to build a new society. Digong is doing the same with his war on drugs, to keep us from becoming a narco-state. You might say in this regard, he and his followers have fallen into the same trap as President Marcos. Nothing at all should justify the killing of people in the name of a better world. Unfortunately, it is not only autocrats who fall for this trap, but Western leaders as well. What am I talking about? Well, successive American presidents since the time of Ronald Reagan have supported the war on drugs in Latin America, to the tune of funding some Latin American countries to the tune of billions, resulting in deaths of tens of thousands. All right. In fact, the murders in Duterte's war on drugs pales in comparison when you stack them up against the US-backed regimes in Peru, Colombia, Mexico. I've actually crunched the numbers and published my findings on BlogWatch. Very quickly, here are some stats for you, right? Now, what I did in that post was that I took several countries, namely El Salvador, Colombia, and Mexico, which have pursued their own versions of the war on drugs. I took the years in which, I chose the years in which killings had peaked during their campaigns. And of course, the stats were reported in the World Bank, so that was my source for the data, and in some publications as well. And I just compared them with what happened this past year and a half under Oplan Double Barrel, or Oplan Tokhang under President Duterte, right? So here are some stats for you. In El Salvador's Mano Dura, or Iron Fist, in calendar year 2015, there were 6,657 intentional homicides during that year. Now, El Salvador is in Central America, and it has a population of 6.4 million people. So these intentional murders translate into deaths of 104 for every 100,000 people in El Salvador. 104. Now that is by far the highest, which ranks El Salvador as the murder capital of the world, which overtaking Honduras, right, during that year. So that was at the height. What happened in El Salvador is there were these gangs, and they, after the civil war that happened, a lot of these gangs, they were deported by the U.S. in their domestic war on drugs. They were illegal immigrants in places like LA. They were then deported. They had developed that drug culture there. When they were deported to El Salvador, they brought that with them. And so this created a situation where after the Civil War, violence between these gangs, rival gangs, erupted. And the government, the leftist government, which had fought, dictatorship, had no choice but to initiate and brought in the military again in order to fight, in order to prevent this gang rivalry. And so that was the campaign of Mano Dura, with the support of the population that had just gotten tired of it. This resulted in 104 deaths per 100,000. In Colombia's war on drugs, there was, under President Gaviria, and during the time of their the drug lord, the famous drug lord Escobar, Pablo Escobar, in 1996, there was 27,315 intentional homicides in that year, 1996, at the height of the war on drugs, right? With a population of 38.1 million. This translates to 71.79 deaths per 100,000. 71.79. So that's, remember, President Gaviria criticized Duterte and said, you're committing the same mistakes that I made. Well, his war on drugs, which was funded by the American government, resulted in a massive 27,000 deaths in 1 year alone at the height of that war. Now, in Mexico, under the Merida Initiative in 2011, there were, with El Chapo, the Mexican drug lord, there was 23,068 deaths. And again, this was funded by the Americans to the tune of billions, right? With a population of 115.7 million at the time, this translated to 22.6 deaths for every 100,000 in the population of Mexico. So now this brings us to the Philippines and the war on drugs, or what's called Oplan Tokhang, or double barrel as it's called in the Philippines. And in the case of the Philippines, there was a little bit of extrapolation that had to be made, because at the time I wrote the blog post, the only data available on intentional homicides covered the months from July to November of 2016. So the first 5 months of President Duterte's administration. Yet in these 5 months, the PNP recorded a total of 5,970 murder cases, right? Now, not all of that involved the war on drugs, as was the case with the other statistics from the other countries that I've cited. The World Bank collects these statistics, and they relate to intentional homicides, which often involve premeditation as opposed to just plain homicide, or manslaughter. If you accidentally run over somebody on the streets unintentionally, there's no intention to do that. That's not classified as an intentional homicide. So these 5,970 murder cases were reported in the crime stats of the PNP, which is the basis for the World Bank's collections, which they report later on. However, be that as it may, these recorded intentional homicides represented an increase of 51% compared to the previous year. So we could say that, what changed was the new policy when Duterte came into power, which was to prosecute the war on drugs more vigorously. So what I did there was that I just merely extrapolated the figures, meaning to say, I said that if this rate of increase continues until the rest of the year, the fiscal year, by the end of the 12-month period from July 2016 to June 2017, the number of intentional homicides would reach 14,000, which would be an increase of about 4,000 more deaths compared to the previous year, when observations were recorded in 2014 of about 9,900 intentional murders. So therefore, I projected that the war on drugs would yield a net increase of about 4,000 additional deaths on top of what would have happened had there not been the war on drugs. And the crime stats of the PNP recently released, in fact, tend to validate those numbers. They recently reported the results for the first 18 months of Duterte in office, from July to the end of September, I believe. And they were roughly around that, and they reported the deaths relating to the war on drugs. And so it was somewhere around the ballpark of about 4,000 if you simply looked at the first 12 months. So if in fact the total number of intentional homicides hasn't been reported yet, or at least I haven't found a source for it, but if in fact it results in 14,000 intentional homicides for the 12-month period, 16 to 17, then that would represent, with a population of about, the Philippines has a population of roughly 104 million people, that would equate to about 13.79 deaths per 100,000. All right, so again, what I did was I took the figure that was reported at that time, 5,970, and then I annualized it. All right, and I ended up with a figure that was close to that was a projected figure at that time. Now we have the actual started trickling in, and my rate of increase was very, very similar or consistent with what the PNP has recently reported. Nevertheless, even with that increase, we can see that Duterte's war on drugs seems in fact more tame when compared with other US-sponsored anti-narcotics efforts in Latin American countries. But, enough with the numbers. Every life is precious, of course, right? The gruesome deaths of 3 teenagers at the hands of Caloocan City Police demonstrates that. It's caused President Rodrigo Duterte to rethink his war on drugs. Fronting up to the media, Duterte confessed that his promise to rid the country of drugs would not be fulfilled during his term. The government's shoot first, ask questions later approach could no longer be sustained. At the Senate, the chief Philippine National Police, with tears in his eyes, swore that no policy promoting vigilante-style executions was in place. This was, of course, questioned by Senator Risa Ontiveros, who said that the president's words to that effect constituted a policy, although it hadn't been written down. The administration has clarified that while the president is fond of making controversial statements, it is his intention to prosecute the war according to the law, and law enforcers who violate the law should, in order to enforce it, should themselves be prosecuted. So it would seem that while Duterte fell for this trap in his first year, he is taking steps to back away from it. A former partyless Congressman, Walden Bello, wrote an article that got published in Rappler claiming that it is all downhill from here for Duterte, that he has lost a thing called moral momentum and that he's not attracting as many followers to his rallies anymore. Is he right? Will Duterte ultimately suffer the same fate as Marcos? Will his misuse of force in the pursuit of his vision ultimately lead to his downfall? We should note, of course, that recently President Duterte has withdrawn the PNP as the lead agency in this war. He's reinstated the Philippine Drug Enforcement Agency to take the lead. They've rescinded Oplan Tokhang. They're refocusing the PNP on all other forms of crime. This move was hailed by the human rights groups as a step in the right direction. A recent survey of Filipinos has shown that they do have apprehensions, that they do feel that execution-style killings are being made despite the disavowals of the government. However, a survey showed that while they believe that that's happening, they still have a high level of trust in President Duterte. It's as if they almost accept that this is the price you have to pay in order to restore order, right? Of course, it's accurate to say that it's all downhill from here because that's true for all presidents, right? After the honeymoon period is over, it's all downhill. However, losing moral momentum is different from losing all legitimacy. My sense is that accounts of Duterte's demise are at this point exaggerated. President Duterte has at least shown some willingness to compromise. He met with the parents of victims, for instance, and promised them justice for their deceased child. He's been willing to pull back from the abyss, in other words. Perhaps this could be interpreted as a form of self-preservation on his part, as the social license for his strict policies might wane. President Duterte doesn't, of course, do anything by half measures or half gestures. His meeting with the parents of victims wasn't tokenistic, as perhaps Pinoy's meeting with the SAF 44 victims was, some might say. His show of compassion and the response to the slain teenagers' parents who hugged him in the end only served to bolster his support from his core supporters. We cannot underestimate his core base of support. While the opposition might continue to chip away at his popularity with the broader public, I personally believe his hold on power remains secure for the time being. This is underscored by the results of the Social Weather Station survey, which found his net approvals, despite falling double digits, remains in the high 40s. And in addition, those expressing much trust in him remain in the low 70s. His Pulse Asia survey results are even more robust. One might say that in the case of Social Weather Survey, trust trumps approval ratings, given the transitory nature of job approvals. But in the Pulse, both his satisfaction and trust scores remain unblemished by recent events. They remain higher than any opposition figure, including the vice president. And vice presidents normally retain higher approval and trust ratings than their presidents, since the time of Arap at least. Of course, a major scandal may erupt that might rock Duterte's credibility to the core, but given the highly polarized nature of our society, it would need to be something earth-shattering for it to cause a major erosion of support. So that brings us to the close of this episode. Part 2 of the series, Can Duterte Avoid the Pitfalls of Marcos? Do drop us a line, follow the links that are appearing now, and use the social media handles there to send us your feedback and comments, and even your suggestions. I'm quite happy to take them all on board. Thank you. It's been a pleasure hosting this episode of The Cusp. I'm Doy Santos. See you again on the next edition of The Cusp.